Galileo was born into a world where each morning reaffirmed the common view that the sun moved around the earth. This belief was confirmed as the sun appeared to pass overhead each day. It was a view of the universe originally set out by the ancient philosopher Aristotle. In the center sat the static earth, the home of man. The sun was just one of many heavenly bodies which circled endlessly around it. Dissenting from this accepted worldview could prove hazardous. A statue of Father Giordano Bruno marks the site in Rome where he was burned alive for a host of unorthodox beliefs. The Vatican considered astronomy to be an investigation of God's work.
The Church's universities had 7 basic subjects that you had to pass before you could go on to philosophy and theology. One of those subjects was astronomy. Studying the stars was a way of getting themselves out of the mundane world into a world that was more transcendent, a world that was beautiful, a world that was eternal.
For the Church, there was also a practical reason to study the heavens. The sky was both a clock and a calendar. Behind the walls of convents, sunrise and sunset defined the cycle of morning and evening prayer. Each spring, the planting of the gardens would commence with the coming of the equinox. The winter solstice foreshadowed Christmas, and the phases of the moon fixed the exact dates of Lent and Easter.
Invano laboraverum, qui edificanteam, nisi Dominus.
The Church used the calendar to give spiritual significance to Aristotle's earth-centered astronomy.
The images were very useful for teaching theology. The earth is not the center of the universe in that it's in a privileged place. It's at the bottom of the universe. Only hell is lower. And there's a chain of creation reaching up to heaven.
As a young man, Galileo toyed briefly with the idea of becoming a priest. Instead, he entered the University of Pisa as a medical student in 1581. The curriculum at Pisa was prescribed by the Jesuit authorities in Rome. Even the anatomy diagrams in Galileo's textbooks had to be approved by the Jesuits. Galileo left medicine behind after only a few months and began instead to study mathematics. Among the many writings he left behind is an eloquent tribute to the power of mathematics to illuminate the world.
This grand book, The Universe, could only be understood if one learned to comprehend the language and the alphabet in which it is composed. That is, the language of mathematics, triangles and circles and geometric figures, without which it was impossible, humanly impossible to understand a word of it. Without it, one wandered as in a dark labyrinth.
It's so confusing, the world. Where do we find truth? Where is the real truth? And there was a sort of consensus, which Galileo felt very deeply, that in mathematics you had real truth. If there was anywhere where human beings could think like God, it was when they were thinking about mathematics. So let's combine precise observation of nature and let's apply that one technique of thought which we know God will share with us, which is mathematics, and let's put the two together, and then we will have a really secure foundation on which we can study things.
Galileo brought his mathematical studies to the University of Padua, 40 miles from Venice, far enough from Rome to be beyond the influence of the Jesuits and their officially approved curriculum.
And Padua itself was a university. It was founded in 1222 by breakaway students. It wasn't chartered by a king or by a pope. It was absolutely free and had the Free Republic of Venice as its supervisor. So getting a job in Padua was as close to getting academic freedom as you could want, certainly in Italy and probably rather uniquely in Europe.
The city of Venice was just a ferry ride from Padua, and it was here that the young professor spent many holidays. Galileo began a liaison with a Venetian woman named Marina Gamba. Little is known about her, but she was far from Galileo's social equal. The affair made his life complicated, but was not unusual, even among faithful Catholics.
Yes, he loved to have a good time. He enjoyed his wine. He enjoyed many forms of pleasure. But that didn't make him a bad Catholic, especially at a time when even the popes had illegitimate children.
Galileo himself had 3 illegitimate children. The eldest, Virginia, was born in 1600.
The birth records in Padua say that she was born of fornication. Because Galileo was not married to her mother, they didn't live together. I suppose he might have lived with her if he'd wanted to, but his house was full of students and he worked at odd hours, so he didn't really keep his mistress or his children in the house where he lived.
Despite these complications, Galileo thrived in the free air of Padua, becoming an ambitious scholar. Always fascinated by new devices, Galileo heard that a craftsman from the Netherlands had found a new use for common eyeglass lenses. The first telescope to reach Venice was a toy, a novelty built to amuse partygoers.
Spectacles, compared to telescopes, are very low tech, but they had been around for several hundred years. It was only when lenses became available in certain range of strengths that one could take the weakest convex lens and combine it with the strongest concave lens and get an appreciable magnifying effect.
Galileo set out to turn the Dutchman's toy into a useful device.
Hearing reports of a new invention from a lens maker in Holland, I determined to fashion a device for myself and was able to make considerable improvements in it.
Galileo realized that spectacle makers could not give him the lenses that he needed in order to make this device more powerful. They just weren't good enough, and they weren't the right strength. And so in order to improve the instrument, he had to teach himself to grind lenses. And that is extremely difficult, and it certainly was in 1610.
At first, Galileo was only interested in the optics of the telescope. With his improved lenses, he increased its power tenfold. But his lenses did more than magnify. By reshaping these pieces of glass, Galileo would eventually reshape our view of the world. With his telescope, Galileo first set out to make some money. The naval arsenal of Venice was the greatest in all of Europe. What if the arsenal had a way to spot enemy ships hours before they appeared in the harbor? Wouldn't this give the Navy a distinct advantage? Installing his new device at the top of St. Mark's Tower, Galileo arranged persuasive, real-life demonstrations.
Numerous gentlemen and senators more than once climbed the stairs of the highest bell towers of Venice to observe vessels so far away at sea that 2 hours and more were required before they could be seen by naked eye without my spyglass.
From within the Venetian Senate came a handsome order for Galileo to supply the arsenal with spyglasses. Galileo was given a generous lifetime salary for his service to the Republic. Part scientist and part self-promoter, for now, his future seemed bright. But soon, his telescope would launch a dispute which would threaten to destroy its creator. Galileo's daughter was just 9 years old on a November night in 1609. That was the evening when Galileo first pointed his new spyglass at the moon setting behind the hills of Padua and began to sketch what he observed. It was the start of 8 weeks of sleepless nights spent in his tiny courtyard, suddenly transformed into the world's premier astronomical observatory.
From my observations, I've been led to the opinion that the surface of the moon is not smooth, uniform, as a great number of philosophers believe it and the other heavenly bodies to be, but is uneven, rough, and full of cavities and prominences, being not unlike the face of the earth, relieved by chains of mountains and deep valleys.
The moon Galileo saw was Earth-like, and he sketched its features with Earth-like detail. If the surface of a heavenly body resembled the Earth, perhaps the heavens and Earth were not as different as everyone thought.
Galileo had observed the moon through a series of phases, and he apparently made some adaptations to his instrument and began exploring the planets. Now, Jupiter was the one that was in the most favorable position for observation. It was closest to the Earth at that particular point. And when Galileo looked at Jupiter, he saw 3 very bright little stars, invisible with the naked eye, on a line with Jupiter. And he remarked on that. He had no idea what they were. I mean, he thought that, of course, they were what they used to call fixed stars. In other words, the things that we call stars. But then, since it's such a remarkable configuration, he came back to it the next night. And, well, yes, there were still 3 stars, but their relative position to Jupiter had changed. And so within a week, he realized that what we have here are moons of Jupiter. Like the moon goes around the Earth, these moons go around Jupiter, and there are 4 of them.
4 planets, never seen from the beginning of the world, right up to our present day. These wandering little stars make their journeys around the planet Jupiter with a marvelous speed and with mutually different motions, like children of the same family.
In a little more than a week, Galileo had found the first new astronomical bodies to be discovered since ancient times. This discovery clashed with the common belief that the heavens revolved around the Earth alone. Eventually, it would bring him head-to-head with church dogma. But for now, Galileo was exuberant.
He rushed into print because he knew he could get scooped. If we date the discovery from the first observation of Jupiter's satellites until he realized they were moons, January the 7th to January the 15th, he was in print by March the 12th. The book was out.
Siderius Nuncius, the starry messenger, was an enthusiastic announcement of telescopic astronomy. The first printing sold out within days, and news spread across Europe of Galileo and his amazing telescope. Galileo became an advocate for his new astronomy and for scientific observation. But as his fame spread, so did his reputation for arrogance.
Sir, your ignorance of astronomy confounds me. I think if you spat on the ground, you'd see a new star in the shine of your own saliva. Well, as for you, my lord, I'm astonished that you persist in trying to prove something to me with the testimony of expert witnesses. Then I can perfectly well find out for myself with a simple experiment. See, witnesses are useful, of course, in difficult matters in the past. I mean, a judge might, for example, call a witness to establish whether Luigi stabbed Giovanni. But he's not going to call a witness to establish that Giovanni was stabbed at all because he's got the wound in front of him. Do you see? He could see it with his own eyes.
Modesty never came easily to the young professor.
I render grace to God that it has pleased him to make me alone the first observer of an admirable thing kept hidden all these ages.
By making the invisible now visible, the telescope was starting to revolutionize astronomy. From ancient times, astronomers had tried to account for the observed motions of heavenly bodies by assuming that they were attached to transparent crystal spheres, rotating sphere within sphere. The Greek astronomer Ptolemy worked out the system in great detail to explain the motions of the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets, all that could be seen with the naked eye. At the center of Ptolemy's intricate system sat the Earth, solid and unmoving.
The Ptolemaic system was filled with ingenious geometrical devices. It made it possible for people to compute where the planets were to be, and this was useful, let us say, for astrology. It was useful if you just wanted to keep track of where things were in the sky. But it wasn't perfect.
60 years before the telescope, a Polish clergyman, Nicholas Copernicus, noticed that the calculations needed to predict the positions of the planets in the sky would be simplified if he assumed that the sun, rather than the Earth, were at the center of the universe.
Copernicus described the sun as though on a royal throne, ruling the planets that circled around it. It was a wonderful system aesthetically. For decades after his book, most astronomers simply suspended judgment. The reason was that there was no observational evidence that the Earth moved. In fact, it seemed almost silly that the Earth moved.
In the Copernican system, the Earth was never still. It had two separate motions, revolving around the sun each year and spinning on its axis once each day.
Copernicus was a little bit reluctant even to publish his system because he figured there would be a lot of criticism of it.
The thing that Copernicus suggested just made him really the laughing stock of Europe, because he was saying here is the Earth is actually whizzing round at a huge speed, about 700 or 800 miles an hour. That's just going round on its axis. And in addition, it's going round the sun at about 30 miles a second. I mean, they were saying, this is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, look at the ground. It's as solid as you can see. Clearly, the Earth is not moving. Nothing could be more obvious than the fact that the Earth isn't moving. If it was moving, everything would be flying off it. I mean, church steeples would fall down, birds couldn't keep up with it, clouds would go disappearing over the western horizon and things like this.
Galileo had read Copernicus and already suspected that the Copernican system was correct. But even with his telescope, he did not see a way of proving that the Earth moved around the sun. First, he would make a move himself, back to Tuscany, the land of his birth. Florence, the Tuscan capital, held a great attraction for the rising young star. The exalted home of Dante and Michelangelo, Florence had been ruled for centuries by the Medici family. A source of great wealth and power, the family dominated banking and commerce and was influential in church matters. The spheres of the Medici coat of arms adorned palaces throughout the city. For Galileo, there could be no greater honor than to have as a patron Duke Cosimo de' Medici.
Galileo is looking for social improvement. And he has tried several times to get patronage from the Medici. And here, he sees his ticket. The Grand Duke of Tuscany is one of 4 brothers. Galileo has discovered 4 moons around Jupiter. Shrewdly wants to name him after his prospective Medici patrons.
A copy of the Starry Messenger, Galileo's finest telescope, and a personal plea are dispatched to Florence.
It is up to our sovereign whether I spend the rest of my days here in Venice or return to Florence. If I'm to return, I desire that your highness shall give me leave and leisure without my being occupied in teaching. Finally, I desire of his highness that in addition to the title of mathematician, he will annex the title of philosopher.
Galileo points out how bad his position is at Padua, how he doesn't have any time for research, how he's overrun by students, and what he would like would be to serve a great ruler and to do research.
A few weeks later, a letter was issued from the Medici offices at the Uffizi, inviting Galileo to join the Medici court as mathematician and philosopher. Here he would be at the center of Florentine intellectual and social life.
Florentines were known for arguing about everything, having lively discussions, and that's what Galileo was about. And there was tremendous appeal for him, and even more status in being attached to the court of the Grand Duke. And there were friends of Galileo's who warned him that he wouldn't be as safe in his radical beliefs in Tuscany, that Venice had more of a sense of independence from the Pope than Tuscany had.
The Medicis were rich and cultured, but they were also beholden to Rome. With strong ties to the Vatican, the family had produced many popes and cardinals. They could not have known the difficulties their new philosopher would bring upon himself. Leaving behind his mistress and his young son, Galileo placed his daughter Virginia and her younger sister Livia in the convent of San Matteo at Arcetri outside Florence.
It was not unusual in Italy at that time to put young girls in a convent for safekeeping, to make sure they remained virgins, although it was no guarantee. But because Virginia was illegitimate, her chances for marriage were more complicated than they might have been. She would have needed a large dowry and the proper husband. And Galileo was not a wealthy man.
Young nuns like Virginia were expected to loosen their ties to the outside world. Even their families would be kept at a distance.
To look at what happened to the father-daughter relationship once Virginia had taken her vows gives one a sense of terrible loss, almost a living death. There's a physical barrier between them in this grill. And yet, that again overlooks the tremendous pride of the typical Italian Catholic family then, of having a priest in the family, a nun. You were putting that child in the service of God, and what could be more important?
I would not say that his placing his daughters in the convent was in any sense an act of faith on his part. In fact, it was an avenue of something to do with them, because after all, their mother had only been his mistress. They were illegitimate, hence presumably not marriageable. So what to do? He supported them, but not very lavishly.
Over the course of 20 years, daughter Virginia would write dozens of private letters to her father from behind the convent walls. Galileo's servants carried the letters in baskets of food or clothing. Many of Virginia's letters survive, although all of her father's responses have been lost. Her letters suggest an enduring bond between the two, despite the harsh conditions of convent life.
Most illustrious Lord Father, my room is terribly cold now, and I cannot see how I will be able to stand it, sire, unless you help me by lending me one of your bed hangings, ones that you will not need to use. I am returning the rest of your collars, which I have sewn. I pray that the Lord grant you the greatest possible well-being. From San Matteo in Arcetri, your affectionate daughter.
In contrast to his daughter's life, Galileo's was becoming more comfortable and secure enough to take a risk, even in the doctrinaire atmosphere of Florence. Galileo adopted the view that Copernicus was right. The sun, not the earth, was the center of our planetary system. Months passed as he struggled for a way to prove it.
For him, demonstration was the mark of science. For something to count as a scientific claim, it had to be demonstrated. It had to be conclusively shown to be the case. Anything short of that was called conjecture or opinion.
While he searched for a demonstration, a letter arrived from one of his followers, Benedetto Castelli, suggesting that the planet Venus could hold the key.
My dear Galileo, if Copernicus is correct, and Venus revolves around the sun rather than the Earth, it is clear that she would be seen not unlike the phases of the moon, sometimes as crescent and sometimes not. Pray tell me, if with your wonderful telescopes you have noticed such an appearance?
To the naked eye, Venus was just a point of light, but through his telescope, Galileo saw the planet as a disk. Over a period of months, Venus changed from a small disk to a larger crescent. Galileo immediately grasped that in a sun-centered system, this crescent would appear as Venus circled in an orbit between the sun and the Earth. Venus must be revolving around the sun rather than the Earth.
With absolute necessity, I had to accept the theory of Copernicus that Venus revolves around the sun, as do all the planets, including the Earth. No longer did we have to endure any argument, however feeble, from persons whose philosophy had been badly upset by this new arrangement of the universe.
But the argument was just beginning, and Galileo utterly misjudged the opposition. Opportunistic priests in Florence announced from their pulpits that Galileo was spouting dangerous new ideas. A chorus of jealous academics, bruised by Galileo's arrogance, joined the clamor. Galileo counted on his Medici patrons to protect him, but that protection started to erode when the Grand Duke Cosimo's mother began to have doubts.
One of Galileo's young protégés was teaching mathematics and astronomy, Benedetto Castelli, and he got invited to one of the intellectual brunches that Cosimo's mother, the Grand Duchess Christina, was wont to put on. And so the conversation got around to these satellites of Jupiter.
Galileo had named the moons of Jupiter for the Medici family, but the Grand Duchess questioned their authenticity.
Are they real? Oh yes, said Castelli, even the Jesuits down in Rome have confirmed this. And then she switched the subject. She said, what about Copernicus? And what about Joshua at the Battle of Gibeon, when he commanded the sun and not the earth to stand still?
In the book of Joshua, the Lord halts the movement of the sun, allowing the Israelites a bit more daylight to defeat their enemies. This and a half dozen other biblical passages seem to suggest that it was the sun which moved, not the earth. The Grand Duchess Christina worried that her new court philosopher was contradicting the Bible. Galileo answered Madama Christina with a letter that went far beyond astronomy.
I agreed with Madama Christina that the Holy Scripture never lies. That the decrees contained therein are absolutely true and inviolable. Right, I should have added that though the Scripture never errs, its interpreters and expounders are liable to err in many things when they base themselves always on the literal meaning of the words.
Galileo was honest when he said that if the Bible seemed to say something different from what science said, then you had just misinterpreted the Bible.
I believe that the Holy Writ exists in order to persuade men of the truths necessary for salvation. It's not necessary that the same God that gave us our speech and our senses, our intellects, would have us put aside those things. Particularly in the case of science, where it's not the smallest mention in the Holy Bible. If the sacred scribes meant to teach men astronomy, then why did they leave it out?
Galileo's outspoken letter to Madama Christina, intended to resolve the discrepancies between science and the Bible, came to be seen as an assault on the Bible itself.
And that letter gets circulated, and local priests read it, and they're outraged, and they're sending copies to Rome, and they're saying to people at the Inquisition, you should investigate Galileo, you should do something about this guy's a heretic.
Galileo surely knew what could happen to heretics when the cardinals of the Inquisition organized to purify society by combating heresy. Much of their work was the banning of books, but the Inquisition also had the powers of both torture and execution. Rome's dungeons had seen the end of many heretics, including the infamous Giordano Bruno, fallen priest and occult dabbler in science. To the Inquisition, extreme measures were justified. Whatever pain was inflicted to save the soul of a heretic was nothing compared to the pain of eternal damnation.
One of the things that the papacy wants to show to a united Europe, Catholics above all, is that there's no tolerance for dissent, that dissent will be rooted out and punished. A Scottish heretic is burned at the stake with a pitch shirt so that he'll burn all the more brightly. And Bruno, who's burned alive, which is quite unusual. Most people are burned when corpses, is one of a whole series of people who are put to death as a way of showing that orthodoxy will be enforced.
Giordano Bruno was a priest and a New Age charlatan who denied the divinity of Christ. But like Galileo, he had described a vision of the universe which had the earth spinning around the sun.
There's been a lot of different views as to how much the Bruno parallel weighed on Galileo. Undoubtedly, it must have had some influence. He realized, of course, what had happened to Bruno. I doubt if he thought himself to be in danger of that, but at the same time, there was that looming thing in the background that if he defied the Inquisition here, he could suffer very severe penalties.
Behind Bruno's execution was Rome's greatest inquisitor, the hammer of heretics, Roberto Cardinal Bellarmine. Now, years later, this same Cardinal Bellarmine was receiving reports about Galileo.
Church theologians have been alert to the possible implications of what Galileo is doing. And there is slowly somewhat of a Galileophile building in Rome, in the Inquisition. And as these noises coming from the lower tier of the clergy in Florence become louder and louder and louder in Rome, Galileo goes to Rome to try to argue his case.
I decided to stand openly alone on the theatre of the world, to bear witness to the sober truth. I believe that good philosophers, like eagles, fly alone, not in flocks, like starlings. I wanted people to understand that nature not only gave them eyes to see her works, but brains to make them capable of understanding them.
Galileo journeyed to Rome in the winter of 1616. As a member of the Medici court, he became a guest of the Tuscan ambassador at the palatial Villa Medici. Perched on a hill overlooking the city, from his balcony, Galileo could see the domes of the Vatican as he eagerly awaited his meeting with the Inquisitor, Cardinal Bellarmine.
Galileo tended to overestimate his own powers of persuasion. He thought that if he could go down to Rome and talk to some of the hierarchy, he could easily persuade them to remain open on the question of was the earth moving or was the earth fixed.
Theologians listened as Galileo confidently made the case for Copernicus.
Galileo is fully committed to the Copernican theory, and we mustn't see the church there as a monolith. I mean, he goes to see bishops and cardinals and theologians, and he argues his case, of course, very passionately. However, the Medici ambassador to the Vatican is writing home, listen, Galileo needs to be calm, to shut up, not go around, arguing his case so much.
In his letter, the ambassador worried that the Medici family might be drawn into an ugly controversy.
Galileo is passionately involved in this fight of his, and he may well get himself in serious trouble, along with anyone who supports his views. This business is not a joke, and the man is staying here under our protection.
He thought he could convince the more open-minded theologians in Rome of the merits of the Copernican doctrine. He thought also that he could convince them that the matter of astronomy was not a matter for theologians in the first place. And so even though he must have acutely known the powers and the dangers of opposing the Inquisition, he evidently thought his own powers of persuasion were such that he could bring them around to his view.
But as he began talking up the Copernican system, he also raised alarm signals, and the conservatives in the Catholic Church decided that something had to be done.
Galileo actually welcomed the chance to make his case to Cardinal Bellarmine. He had heard that Bellarmine had an interest in astronomy and was fascinated by the telescope.
Bellarmine himself, who began interested in science, as he progressed in science, realized that there were a number of aspects to scientific discovery that threatened orthodoxy as he saw it, and realized that science might interfere with his theology, and decided at that point to shut down his scientific investigations. And he made a personal choice to opt for piety rather than scientific curiosity. which never, I think, is a completely satisfactory solution. And it may explain some of his virulence in going after what he perceives as scientific heresy.
The pious Cardinal Bellarmine had countenanced burning men alive, but he was ethereal and unworldly. Even the ruling families of Italy considered the cardinal a bit too saintly. For Galileo, counting on the influence of his Medici patrons, the cardinal's incorruptible piety was not good news. But Galileo never even had a chance to persuade Bellarmine. 3 days before his planned meeting with the cardinal, the Holy Office of the Inquisition met at the Collegio Romano to vote on the theories of Copernicus.
The theologians get involved, and they're giving their professional opinion about this matter. And that professional opinion is that the proposition that the sun is the center of the world and that the earth is going around the sun are propositions that are, in view of the scriptures, heretical.
The vote was 11-0. The hypothesis that the earth moved was foolish and absurd. The belief that the sun was the center of the world was a matter of formal heresy. Cardinal Bellarmine would use his meeting with Galileo to deliver the edict.
Galileo will be told formally not to hold and defend the Copernican position. And what's more, in the decision it is stated that should Galileo refuse this order, he will be silenced.
Galileo is forced to turn his back on Copernicus, whose work is added to the index of prohibited books.
When the theologians were merely thinking of prohibiting Copernicus's book, I held it to be true. Then those learned gentlemen actually did prohibit the work, declaring its opinions to be false and contrary to Scripture. Knowing, as I do, that it always behooves us to accept the decisions of the authorities, guided as they are by a higher insight than my humble brain could ever attain to. I declared my former defense to be merely a poetical conceit, a dream, a fancy of my own. A mere chimera.
Galileo had been certain that he could turn the church to his new astronomy. But instead, matters had become much worse. With the stroke of a quill, the church had banned Copernicus and for now, muzzled Italy's greatest scientist. If there were to be a struggle between religion and science, religion had won the first round. Only months after Galileo's collision with the church, his oldest daughter embraced one of its most ancient rituals. Renouncing her worldly possessions, she surrendered her given name Virginia and chose for herself the name Sister Maria Celeste. By tradition, a name whispered to her by God.
Vuoi consacrarti e solennemente come sposa al nostro Signore Gesù Cristo?
Sì, lo voglio.
I think she chose her name for him, Maria Celeste, because he was so interested in the stars. Of course, it's not an out-of-the-realm name for a nun. It could be chosen completely in a religious context and would still make sense. But she was so clever that I feel certain that that was her intent.
Questa tua serva, sorella nostra. Io, Suor Maria Celeste, a lode e gloria di Dio, mi affido con tutto il cuore a questa famiglia religiosa.
In nomine Padre et Figli et Spiriti Sancti. Amen.
Although their lives were difficult, many of the intelligent young women actually chose the convent because they knew that would be the place they could think and write, and they had more status in society than they might have had even as married women with children. Galileo was a good Catholic, so he had no interest in fighting the church. What he was about from the very beginning of his public support of Copernicus was to bring the church to an understanding of the theory and of the theory's complete lack of threat to the church. If the church struck a defensive posture about something that looked like it had a very good chance of being true in fact, the church would face embarrassment.
Galileo vented his frustration in outspoken letters to close friends and supporters.
To ban Copernicus, when his doctrine is daily reinforced with many new observations, seems, in my judgment, to be a contravention of the truth, hiding and suppressing her when she's most clearly and plainly revealed. Despite the advances of Copernicus, within his theory are couched mystery so sublime and concepts so profound that hundreds and hundreds of the most acute minds have still not pierced them.
Cardinal Bellarmine may have slammed the door on Copernicus, but his philosophy left one small opening for Galileo to seize upon.
Cardinal Bellarmine had argued that the church can change its opinion, but only if there is real proof that the earth goes around the sun.